Hi guys, welcome back. Tonight, we are plunging into the gripping survival saga of the Endurance, Sir Ernest Shackleton's legendary vessel that was swallowed by the Antarctic pack ice in 1915. We will explore how 28 men survived nearly 2 years in the Great White Silence through a combination of sheer psychological grit and a meticulous mechanical mastery of their dwindling resources. From the physics of the James Caird lifeboat to the modern rediscovery of the wreck on the seabed, we are unpacking the ultimate study in human resilience and leadership. To understand the story of Sir Ernest Shackleton and the crew of the Endurance, you must first settle into the atmospheric weight of a very specific kind of silence. It is not the silence of a quiet room, but the vast, ringing quiet of the Southern Ocean. In the late months of 1914, while the rest of the world was descending into the mechanical roar of the Great War, 28 men were sailing toward the bottom of the map, seeking a realm where time is measured not by clocks, but by the slow grinding pulse of the ice. You would likely not survive this journey, at least, not without understanding the psychological armor required to face the Great White Silence, a place where the air is so cold it turns your breath into crystals, and the horizon is a seamless blur of white on white. The narrative begins with the social etiquette of the last outpost. In December 1914, the Endurance made its final stop at South Georgia Island, a rugged, mountainous sliver of rock populated by Norwegian whalers. The social protocol of this outpost was one of grim warning. The whalers, who knew the Weddell Sea better than any men alive, looked at Shackleton's sturdy wooden ship and shook their heads. They spoke of a heavy ice year, a season where the pack ice was moving north with unusual aggression. The social rule of the whaler was respect the pack. Shackleton, however, was driven by a specific Edwardian ambition, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. His goal was to be the first to cross the continent from sea to sea. The social etiquette of the era demanded a certain stiff upper lip in the face of such warnings. On December 5th, the Endurance weighed anchor, leaving the last trace of human civilization behind and steering into the unknown. As the ship moved south, the men entered the registry of the first ice. At first, the ice was a novelty: small, flat pancakes that bumped gently against the hull. The social rule of the deck was one of transition. The men, a mix of seasoned sailors and university-educated scientists, had to learn the rhythmic shush of the ship cutting through the slush. The social protocol was to maintain a routine of normalcy. They played football on the larger ice floes. They sang songs around the ship's piano. They exercised the 70 sled dogs that lived in dogloos on the deck. The social expectation was that this was a voyage of discovery, not a fight for life. But the Weddell Sea had a different set of rules. It is a giant, clockwise, rotating gyre, a trap of moving ice that has been called the worst sea in the world. Then came the rule of the soft trap. By mid-January 1915, the Endurance was within sight of the Antarctic continent. But the ice was no longer pancake thin. It was a vast, interlocking jigsaw puzzle of floes, some miles wide. The social rule for the captain, Frank Worsley, was find the lead. A lead is a narrow lane of open water through the ice. The social etiquette of the crow's nest required a scout to spend hours in the freezing wind, looking for a shimmer of dark water in a desert of white. On January 18th, a strong northeasterly gale began to pack the ice tightly against the continental coast. The Endurance was not hit by a sudden iceberg. She was simply embraced. The ice closed in around her like a slow-motion vice, cushioned by soft snow. The social rule of the ship changed in an instant. They were no longer sailors. They were inhabitants of the pack. One of the most vital social rules of this period was the regulation of the ship-bound winter. Shackleton, ever the master of human morale, realized that if the men felt like prisoners, they would descend into despair. The social rule was make the ship a home. He ordered the ship to be turned into a winter station. The dogs were moved onto the ice, and the men converted the main hold into a communal living space, nicknamed the Ritz. The social etiquette of the Ritz was one of forced cheerfulness. There were mandatory social evenings with haircutting competitions, mock trials, and lectures on everything from biology to the history of the London docks. The social goal was to keep the mind as active as the feet. If a man withdrew into silence, Shackleton would personally intervene, engaging him in a game of bridge or a discussion about the future. Here is the quirky bit: the meteorological etiquette. The men became obsessed with the minute-by-minute changes in the weather. The social rule was, check the glass. They lived by the readings of the barometers and the thermometers. In the great white silence, the weather isn't just a conversation starter. It is the judge and jury. They learned the social language of the ice, the creaks and groans that signaled the pack was under pressure. A frost smoke rising from a lead of water was a sign of extreme cold, while a blue tint in the ice signaled age and strength. This created a social hierarchy of weather wisdom. The scientists who managed the instruments were the high priests of the ship, and their daily reports were the only news that mattered. Now, scholars love to argue over the Shackleton versus Scott leadership styles. While Captain Scott's expeditions were characterized by a rigid naval hierarchy, Shackleton's social rule was one of democratic hardship. He made the scientists perform the same menial tasks as the sailors, scrubbing floors, feeding dogs, and shoveling snow. This flattened the social structure of the ship, creating a bond of mutual respect that would become their greatest asset. The boring but vital truth is that the survival of the Endurance crew started not when the ship sank, but in these long months of waiting. The social rules of the winter station ensured that when the crisis finally came, they were not 28 individuals, but a single, synchronized organism. You find yourself standing on the deck of the Endurance in the middle of the Antarctic night. The ship is frozen fast in a field of white that stretches to the end of the world. The only sound is the low, rhythmic thrum of the wind in the rigging and the occasional, thunderous crack of the ice miles away. The air is so cold that the moisture on your eyelashes has turned to frost. You look down at the ice, which looks like a sea of marble under the starlight. You realize that you are not moving, yet the entire pack is drifting slowly, hundreds of miles toward the north. You feel a strange sense of peace in the great white silence. You are at the center of a clock that has stopped, waiting for the world to begin again. So, as we settle into the imaginary hush of the frozen sea, remember that the story of Shackleton is a journey of stillness before it is a journey of movement. It was a place where the rules of the world were replaced by the rules of the ice, and where your survival was measured by your ability to find warmth in a game of cards or a song. They proved that the human spirit can remain vibrant even when it is locked in a cage of crystal. As long as they have the leadership to look at the ice and see not a prison, but a path. To truly grasp the predicament of the Endurance, one must move away from the human social structures and enter the physics of the ice itself. In the winter of 1915, the ship was no longer a vessel. It was a foreign object lodged within a colossal, shifting jigsaw puzzle of frozen seawater. The Weddell Sea is a relentless machine of pressure. As the winds and currents rotate the massive ice pack, the flotsam the size of small cities and 30 feet thick begin to collide. When these masses meet, the energy has nowhere to go but up. This creates pressure ridges, where the ice buckles and heaves into jagged walls. You would likely not survive the psychological strain of this environment. A world where the very ground beneath you is constantly screaming under the weight of a continent's worth of momentum. The primary force at work was the physics of the ice vice. By midwinter, the Endurance was subjected to a phenomenon known as rafting. This occurs when one giant sheet of ice is driven over the top of another. When the Endurance was caught between these sheets, the pressure was not a sudden blow, but a slow, agonizing squeeze. The ship's hull was built of solid oak and Norwegian fir, reinforced until it was nearly 7 feet thick, in places designed specifically to be buoyant under pressure, meaning the rounded shape was intended to let the ship pop up like a wet bar of soap when squeezed. However, the Antarctic ice does not always play by the rules of naval architecture. In some instances, the ice would grip the ship's keel with such friction that it held her fast, forcing the wooden ribs to absorb every ounce of the crushing force. One must consider the acoustics of the breaking ship. For the men living inside the Ritz, the sound was the most haunting element. In the silence of the Antarctic night, the pressure would manifest first as a low, distant rumble, like an approaching train. As the pressure reached the ship, the wood began to speak. It started with chirps and creaks, sounds that Shackleton compared to the cries of a living creature. As the force intensified, it became a series of thunderous cracks that echoed through the hull like artillery fire. The iron-hard oak beams would bend and groan, and the floorboards would suddenly arch upward under the strain. The men had to learn to live within this symphony of destruction, sleeping in their bunks while the walls around them vibrated with enough power to pulverize a lesser vessel. By August, the structural failure of the stern became the focal point of the crisis. The ice had a specific way of attacking the ship's weakest points, the rudder and the propeller. Despite the crew's efforts to hack away the ice with long saws and picks, the pack eventually twisted the rudder post with the ease of a man snapping a dry twig. The ship began to leak. This was the start of a grueling mechanical battle. The men were organized into pump watches, working the hand pumps in 2-hour shifts to keep the freezing water from reaching the engines. This was a war of attrition against the sea. In the dim light of the hold, the rhythmic clank-clush of the pumps became the heartbeat of the ship, a mechanical counterpoint to the chaotic groaning of the ice outside. Then there was the observation of the bending deck. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, noted with a clinical detachment, bow under the pressure until they resembled an archer's bow. The nails would pop out of the wood with the sound of pistol shots. The men watched as the heavy iron boilers of the engine room were lifted off their mounts. It was at this stage that the great white silence was replaced by the great white noise. The pack was no longer a flat plain. It was a landscape in upheaval. Blocks of ice weighing 20 tons were tossed about like pebbles, and the ship was tilted at a list of nearly 30 degrees, making even the act of walking across a room an exercise in balance. The quirky, yet terrifying, element of this stage was the ice flowers and the frost rime. As the ship was crushed, the seawater forced upward through cracks in the ice would freeze into delicate, crystalline structures. Inside the ship, the moisture from the men's breath would freeze against the cold walls, forming a layer of rime 2 inches thick. This created a bizarre, sparkling interior that looked like a cavern of diamonds, but it was a sign of the ship's dying heat. The temperature in the living quarters dropped below freezing, and the Ritz became a refrigerator. Every object, a book, a boot, a piece of hardtack, became a source of biting cold. The men had to keep their sleeping bags from touching the walls, lest they be frozen to the ship itself. The final transition occurred when the keel was pierced. In late October, a particularly violent surge of pressure drove a tongue of ice directly through the ship's stern. The water poured in with a volume that the pumps could no longer handle. Shackleton, observing the scene from the deck, saw the mainmast whip back and forth like a blade of grass in the wind. He realized that the mechanical limit of wood and iron had been reached. The ice had won. He famously gave the order to abandon ship, but it was not a frantic scramble. It was a methodical move from a dying wooden world to a cold, white one. The men lowered the lifeboats and the remaining supplies onto the floe, standing on the very ice that was killing their home. You find yourself standing on the ice, 30 yards away from the Endurance. You are watching a silhouette that has been your entire world for nearly a year. The ship is twisted, its masts leaning at impossible angles, its hull splintered and weeping water into the snow. The silence has returned, but it is different now. The ice is no longer a sound. It is the ground under your feet, and it is 3,000 miles away from the nearest human being. You feel the vibration of the pack beneath your boots, a low, rhythmic thrumming that tells you the pressure is not over. You realize that the ship was merely a shield, and now that shield is gone. You are standing on the surface of the sea, separated from the abyss by only a few feet of frozen water. So, as we settle into the imaginary straining of the timber and the cold, rhythmic clank of the pumps, remember that the story of Shackleton is a lesson in the limits of materials. It was a place where oak was turned into splinters, and where the only thing that did not break under the pressure was the human will. They proved that a ship can be crushed, but the purpose of the crew can remain intact, even as the walls of their world disappear into the white. When the Endurance was finally surrendered to the ice, the men were forced into a new and precarious state of existence. They were no longer sailors on a ship. They were inhabitants of the ocean camp, a cluster of canvas tents pitched on a single, massive sheet of ice drifting through the Weddell Sea. This phase of the journey was defined by a profound transition in the nature of home. The ground beneath their feet was not terra firma, but a floating raft of frozen seawater, perhaps 10 feet thick, moving at the mercy of the wind and the hidden currents below. You would likely find the psychological weight of this transition unbearable, the realization that your entire world is a temporary platform, slowly melting and cracking as it moves toward warmer northern waters. The first priority was the establishment of the ice village. Shackleton selected a large, heavy floe that seemed resistant to the immediate pressure of the surrounding pack. The men salvaged everything they could from the dying ship: 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, as well as the remaining sled dogs, crates of food, and the heavy canvas tents. The layout of the camp was dictated by the topography of the ice. The tents were arranged in a circle, and a galley was established using a stove fashioned from an oil drum. This was a world of white on white, where the only splashes of color were the dark wood of the lifeboats and the shadows cast by the midnight sun. The men had to learn the physics of living on a surface that was constantly flexing with the ocean's swell. Life in Ocean Camp was a battle against the moisture of the floor. Unlike the dry, wooden decks of the ship, the floor of a tent on the ice was a layer of snow and frozen brine. The men slept in reindeer skin or wool sleeping bags placed directly on the ice. The heat from their bodies would slowly melt the surface beneath them, creating a shallow pool of water that would eventually soak through the fabric. Everything was perpetually damp. The great white silence was often interrupted by the sound of the ice singing, a high-pitched whistling caused by the wind blowing over the cracks in the pack. To survive, the men had to maintain a clinical obsession with their gear. Drying a pair of socks became a task that could take days, requiring the items to be stuffed inside a shirt to use body heat as the only available furnace. A critical element of survival was the calculation of the drift every day. The navigator, Frank Worsley, would take sightings of the sun or stars using a sextant. These measurements were the only way the men knew where they were. They were drifting northwest, moving roughly 5 to 10 miles a day. This was a passive journey. They could not row the ice floe. They could only ride it. The map of their progress was a jagged line through an empty sea. The men watched as they passed the Antarctic Circle, moving closer to the open ocean where the ice would eventually break apart. This created a paradoxical sense of hope and dread. Moving north meant getting closer to potential rescue, but it also meant that their solid ground was destined to disintegrate. The diet at Ocean Camp shifted toward the harvest of the pack. As the ship's rations of flour and tinned meat dwindled, the men became reliant on the local inhabitants, seals and penguins. This was a nutritional necessity, as the fresh meat provided the vitamin C needed to ward off scurvy. The men learned to appreciate the high-calorie value of seal blubber, which was used for both food and fuel. The smell of the camp became a mixture of seal oil, smoke, and damp wool. Cooking was an exercise in patience. The blubber stove produced a thick, black, soot-heavy smoke that coated the men's faces until they looked like miners. This layer of soot, ironically, provided a small measure of protection against the harsh ultraviolet rays reflecting off the snow. One of the most haunting features of this period was the sinking of the Ghost. For several weeks after it was abandoned, the Endurance remained visible, a broken, spectral shape, half submerged in the ice a short distance away. On November 21, 1915, the pressure finally delivered the coup de grace. Shackleton, standing on a mound of ice, shouted, "She's going, boys." The men watched in silence as the ship's stern rose high into the air. And then, with a final groan of splintering wood, she slid beneath the ice into the 3,000-foot depths. The last physical link to the world of the living was gone. The silence that followed was the heaviest they had yet experienced. They were now truly alone, 28 men on a sheet of ice in the middle of a frozen ocean. The quirky, yet vital tool of this era was the pemmican and the bannock. Pemmican was a dense, high-fat paste made of dried meat and lard, specifically designed for polar exploration. At Ocean Camp, the men would fry this into a hoosh, a thick stew. To supplement this, the cook, Charles Green, would bake bannocks, flatbreads made from the last of the flour. The social highlight of the day was the distribution of these rations. Every crumb was precious. If a man dropped a piece of biscuit in the snow, he would meticulously search for it, as those calories were the only fuel keeping his heart beating in the sub-zero temperatures. The men became experts in the economy of the crumb, a meticulous accounting of energy that modern life has entirely forgotten. You find yourself sitting on a wooden crate near the edge of the floe. The sun is a pale, heedless disk hanging low on the horizon, casting shadows that stretch for miles across the hummocked ice. You feel a rhythmic, low-frequency vibration coming up through the seat of your pants, the deep swell of the Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of miles away, finally reaching the pack. The ice beneath you is breathing, rising and falling just a few inches every minute. You look at the tents, their canvas flapping in the biting wind, and you realize that you are living on a biological clock. Every day the air grows slightly warmer, is a day closer to your floor, turning back into water. You are a passenger on a white raft, and the ocean is waiting for you to fall in. So, as we settle into the imaginary slush and creak of the drifting camp, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the transition from ship to shorehaven, when the shore is made of frozen water. It was a place where home was a thin layer of canvas and security was the thickness of a floe. They proved that the human spirit can adapt to the most unstable of foundations. As long as there's a horizon to watch and a crew to share the hoosh with. The drift of the ice pack eventually reached its inevitable, violent conclusion. As the current carried the Patience camp further north, the temperature rose and the massive, solid fields of ice began to shatter. The men were now living on a disintegrating world. The great white silence was replaced by the chaotic roar of the pack edge, where the heavy swells of the open Atlantic met the frozen fringe of the Antarctic. This phase was the most dangerous transition of the expedition. The moment the men had to abandon the ice and trust their lives to 3 small, open wooden boats. You would likely find the scale of this gamble terrifying, trading a platform of ice for 3 slivers of cedar and oak, measuring only 20 to 22 feet long, in the most turbulent waters on Earth. The first challenge was the physics of the launch. On April 9, 1916, the floe they were living on split directly through the center of the camp. Shackleton gave the order to launch the boats. This was not a smooth departure from a dock. It was a desperate scramble to pull the heavy boats over jagged ridges of ice and into a churning lead of water filled with growlers, small ice-dense bergs that could stove in the side of a boat like a hammer. The James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills were heavily overloaded with 28 men and their remaining supplies. The buoyancy of the boats was tested to the limit. With only a few inches of freeboard, the distance from the water to the top of the boat's side, every wave threatened to swamp them. Life in the boats was defined by the physiology of exposure. For the next 7 days, the men were never dry. The temperature was well below freezing, and the spray from the waves turned into a coat of ice over their clothing and the boats themselves. They were subjected to a condition known as immersion foot, where the feet become swollen and painful due to constant cold and moisture. Because the boats were so crowded, the men could not move to maintain circulation. They sat hunched together, using each other's body heat as a shield. The great white silence was now a roar of freezing wind and the rhythmic, hollow thump of the hull against the waves. The psychological strain was immense. They were tiny specks in a vast, gray wilderness of water, uncertain if they would ever see land again. A critical tool during this passage was the art of the sea anchor. To prevent the boats from being rolled over by the massive breaking waves, the men used sea anchors, conical bags of canvas thrown overboard on a long rope. The sea anchor created drag, keeping the bow of the boat pointed into the wind and waves. Without this, the boats would have turned broadside to the swell and been instantly capsized. The men had to manage these lines with frostbitten fingers, ensuring they didn't tangle in the dark. Every hour was a battle of mechanical survival. The great white noise was a constant reminder that the ocean was trying to reclaim the space occupied by their wooden shells. The navigation of this period was the miracle of the sextant and the sun. Frank Worsley, the captain of the Endurance, had to take sights while being tossed by 20-foot waves. To use a sextant, one must see the horizon and the sun simultaneously. In the gray gloom of the Southern Ocean, the sun rarely appeared. When it did, for only a few seconds, Worsley would be held steady by 2 other men so he could snap a measurement. These calculations were the difference between finding a tiny rock in the ocean and drifting into the infinite Atlantic. Their target was Elephant Island, a desolate, glacier-covered mountain of rock at the edge of the South Shetlands. Missing it by even a few miles would mean certain death, as there was no other land for thousands of miles to the east. Diet and hydration became a crisis of salt and ice. The men were surrounded by water, but none of it was drinkable. Their only source of fresh water was the ice they had managed to salvage from the floe before launching. As the days passed, this supply dwindled. Thirst became a gnawing agony, made worse by the salt spray that encrusted their lips and throats. They ate raw seal meat and lumps of nut food, but without water, their bodies struggled to process the protein. The great white silence was now the sound of parched tongues and labored breathing. The men began to suffer from hallucinations, seeing phantom ships or warm houses in the mists of the spray. Shackleton, moving between the 3 boats, remained the anchor of their reality, his voice a calm constant in the chaos. The quirky, yet desperate, element of this stage was the bailing routine. The boats were constantly taking on water from the slopping waves. This required a never-ending cycle of bailing using small tin mugs or wooden buckets. If the bailing stopped for even 10 minutes, the weight of the water would make the boat sluggish and prone to sinking. The men took turns, their movements mechanical and rhythmic, driven by the primal instinct to keep the floor beneath them. This labor was the only thing that kept them from freezing solid. The physical exertion generated a tiny amount of internal heat. The great white noise of the ocean was the drumbeat to which they bailed, a life-or-death rhythm that lasted for 160 grueling hours. You find yourself huddled in the bottom of the James Caird. The world is a monochromatic blur of gray waves and white foam. Your hands are numb, your feet are blocks of ice, and every time the boat drops into the trough of a wave, your stomach lurches with the weight of the descent. You look at Shackleton, who is standing in the stern, his face gray with exhaustion, but his eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind is screaming through the mast, a high-pitched wail that never stops. You realize that you have moved from a world of stillness to a world of violent motion. You are no longer drifting, you are fighting. You feel the cold spray hit your face, and you realize that the great white silence was a luxury. Now there is only the roar of the water and the desperate hope that the gray shadow on the horizon is finally land. So, as we settle into the imaginary pitch and roll of the open sea, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the resilience of the small against the vast. It was a place where a few inches of wood were the only thing between life and the abyss. They proved that a human being can endure the most violent transitions as long as they have a navigator to guide them and a crew willing to bail until the sea finally relents. On April 15, 1916, the 28 men of the Endurance achieved what seemed like a physical impossibility. They stepped onto solid ground for the first time in 497 days. This land was Elephant Island, a desolate, ice-covered tooth of rock at the northern edge of the South Shetland Islands. While the great white silence of the drifting pack was behind them, they were now faced with the black rock reality. Elephant Island was a brutal, windswept purgatory, far removed from any shipping lanes. You would likely find the arrival here to be a bittersweet victory. The ground was no longer melting, but it was also a place where no one would ever think to look for you. The transition to Elephant Island required a complete restructuring of their existence, moving from the floating camp to a permanent siege. The first priority was the establishment of the cave of the boats. The beach they landed on, Point Wild, was a narrow spit of gravel squeezed between a vertical glacier and the churning sea. It was constantly hammered by will-o-wisp hurricane-force gusts of wind that tumbled down from the interior mountains. The canvas tents they had salvaged from the Endurance were shredded by the wind within days. The men were forced to innovate using the only resources they had, the two remaining lifeboats, the Dudley Docker and the Stancomb Wills. They turned the boats upside down and propped them up on low walls of stone and peat. This became the snuggery. You would find this space incredibly claustrophobic. It was a dark, low-ceilinged tunnel where 22 men lived, slept, and cooked in a space barely larger than a modern living room. Life in the snuggery was defined by the physics of the living floor, because the ground was made of permafrost and gravel. The heat from the men's bodies and the blubber stove turned the floor into a mire of mud and penguin guano. The men slept on thwarts or directly on the whetstones, using their remaining gear to insulate themselves from the cold. The air inside was a thick, yellow fog of seal oil smoke and steam from drying clothes. The great white silence was replaced by the constant thrum of the wind against the boat hulls and the rhythmic drip-drip of condensation from the ceiling. To survive this, the men had to maintain a mental discipline of small horizons, focusing only on the next meal or the next hour of sleep to avoid being crushed by the hopelessness of their isolation. A critical challenge of Elephant Island was the harvest of the Gentoo and chintz. The island was home to large colonies of penguins, which became the crew's sole source of survival. The men had to develop a clinical efficiency in hunting and processing the birds. Penguin meat provided the protein, while the skin and blubber provided the fuel for their lamps and stoves. The great white silence was often interrupted by the raucous calls of the penguin colonies, a sound that the men grew to both rely on and loathe. They utilized every part of the bird. Even the bones were used as fuel once the marrow was extracted. This was a Stone Age existence, where the distance between life and starvation was measured in the success of the daily hunt. The health of the men on Elephant Island was a study in attrition and frostbite. Many of the men had arrived at the island in a state of physical and mental collapse. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Macklin, had to perform surgeries in the dim, smoky light of the snuggery, including the amputation of several frostbitten toes belonging to the youngest sailor, Blackborough. The great white silence of the interior glacier loomed over them, a constant reminder of the cold. The lack of fresh water was a persistent issue. They had to melt ice and snow using precious blubber fuel. The men's skin became blackened by the oily smoke, and their eyes were perpetually red and irritated. Despite these conditions, Shackleton maintained a strict routine of morning inspection, ensuring that every man was accounted for, and that morale was guarded with the same intensity as the food supply. The most profound shift occurred with the decision of the 800-mile gamble. Shackleton realized that they could not survive a winter on Elephant Island. The penguin colonies would migrate, and the men would eventually starve or succumb to the cold. He made the decision to take the best lifeboat, the James Caird, and sail 800 miles across the most dangerous ocean on Earth, the Drake Passage, to reach the whaling stations of South Georgia. This was a move of pure desperation. The social structure of the camp split. 6 men would go with the boat, and 22 would stay behind under the command of Frank Wild, the Great White. Silence of the island would now be the backdrop for a long, agonizing wait. The quirky, yet essential, equipment of the snuggery was the blubber lamp. To provide light in the dark interior of the boathouse, the men fashioned lamps out of old sardine tins and pieces of wick made from surgical bandages. These lamps burned seal or penguin oil, producing a dim, flickering, amber light. This light was the center of their social world. Around these tiny flames, the men would read and reread the few books they had saved, including a copy of Encyclopedia Britannica, play games of imaginary dinner, where they would describe in vivid detail the meals they hoped to eat once they were rescued. The great white silence outside was kept at bay by these small rituals of humanity, a flicker of civilization in a world of ice and rock. You find yourself sitting in the shadows of the snuggery, your back against the cold stone wall, and your head nearly touching the damp wood of the Stankham Wills. The air is thick with the smell of scorched oil and the hiss of the melting snow on the stove. Outside, a blizzard is screaming, the wind shaking the boats until you fear they might be blown into the sea. You look at the men around you, their faces are masks of soot and exhaustion. But in the dim light of the blubber lamp, you see them laughing at a joke told for the 100th time. You realize that you are living in a tomb that has been turned into a fortress. You are waiting for a boat that may never return, on an island that the rest of the world has forgotten, yet the great white silence has not yet claimed your spirit. So, as we settle into the imaginary flicker and smoke of the Elephant Island camp, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the resilience of the stationary. It was a place where home was an upturned boat and hope was a 22-foot lifeboat disappearing into the gray horizon. They proved that the human spirit can endure the most desolate of sieges as long as there is a leader to stay behind and a crew to wait for the return of the sun. On April 24, 1916, Sir Ernest Shackleton and 5 hand-picked men pushed a 22.5-foot lifeboat, the James Caird, into the frigid surf of Elephant Island. Their mission was a biological and mechanical gamble of the highest order: to sail 800 miles across the Scotia Sea, a stretch of the Southern Ocean known for its Cape Horn rollers, waves that can reach heights of 50 feet. This journey was the only hope for the 22 men left behind. You would likely find the scale of this boat nearly impossible to reconcile with the scale of the sea. It was a tiny splinter of wood in a world of moving mountains. This phase of the narrative is defined by the physics of the small craft and the sheer, calculated precision of 19th-century celestial navigation. The first challenge was the structural modification of the Caird. Before departure, the ship's carpenter, Chippy McNeish, had worked a miracle of improvisation. He had raised the boat's sides by a few inches and built a makeshift deck out of scrap wood and canvas, sealed with a mixture of oil color and seal blood. This deck was the only thing preventing the boat from being instantly swamped by the freezing spray. To provide stability, McNeish had filled the bottom of the boat with nearly a ton of ballast, a mixture of boulders from the beach and bags of sand. The great white silence of the island was replaced by the violent, rhythmic slap of the water against the hull. The men lived in a space so cramped that they could never stand upright. They were either crouched at the tiller or crawling over the ballast in the dark, wet hold. Navigation during this voyage was the art of the 5-second sight. Frank Worsley was tasked with finding a tiny speck of land South Georgian, a vast featureless ocean, while being tossed like a cork. To do this, he used a sextant to measure the angle of the sun above the horizon. However, in the Scotia Sea, the sun was almost always hidden by thick clouds. On the rare occasions it appeared Worsley had to be held by his waist by 2 other men to keep him from being thrown overboard as he squinted through the eyepiece. He had to account for the leeway, the distance. The wind blew the boat off course and the chronometer error caused by the extreme cold. Missing the island by even 1% would mean the boat would sail into the infinite Atlantic, where the men would eventually perish of thirst. The life of the crew was defined by the physiology of permanent wetness. For 16 days, the 6 men were never dry. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and the constant spray turned into a layer of ice on the deck and rigging. This ice was a lethal threat. Its weight could make the boat top-heavy and prone to capsizing. The men had to take turns crawling onto the slippery, moving deck to hack away the ice with axes. Their hands were swollen and blackened with frostbite, and their skin was raw from the constant friction of salt-soaked wool. The great white silence of the ice was gone, replaced by the gray chaos of the storm. Every meal was a struggle. They heated hush over a small Primus stove balanced between their knees, the blue flame flickering in the damp, oxygen-starved air of the hold. A critical moment of the voyage was the encounter with the rogue wave. On the 11th day, Shackleton, who was at the tiller, saw a line of white on the horizon that he initially mistook for a break in the clouds. He soon realized it was a monster wave, a massive wall of water that had been building momentum for thousands of miles. He shouted, "For God's sake, hold on, it's got us." The wave broke over the boat, burying it in tons of water. The James Caird shuddered and sank deep into the trough, but the ballast and McNeish's canvas deck held. The men spent the next hour bailing frantically with every available pot and mug, fighting the weight of the ocean that had made its way into their home. The great white noise of that wave remained a psychological scar for the rest of their lives. Thirst became the final biological barrier. Toward the end of the 16-day journey, their 2 small water casks became contaminated with seawater. The salt made their tongues swell and their throats feel like they were lined with sandpaper. They began to suffer from the delirium of the deep, where the mind tries to escape the physical pain through vivid hallucinations of freshwater springs and rain-soaked forests. Their only relief was the occasional ice lick scraping the frost off the inside of the boat. Despite the agony, Shackleton enforced a rigid watch system, ensuring that 2 men were always awake to manage the sails and the tiller. The great white silence was now the sound of parched breathing and the relentless hiss of the wake. The quirky, yet miraculous, element of the arrival was the hurricane and the lee shore. Just as they sighted the rugged cliffs of South Georgia, a massive hurricane-force gale struck the island. For 9 hours, they were trapped between the storm and the jagged rocks. Any other boat would have been smashed to pieces, but the James Caird was steered with a desperate, expert hand. At the height of the storm, the same wind that threatened to destroy them actually blew them into the relative safety of King Haakon Bay. On May 10, 1916, they finally drove the boat onto a small pebble beach. Shackleton was the first to jump out, and the men literally crawled onto the land, their legs too weak to support their weight. They had survived the impossible, but they were on the wrong side of the island. You find yourself lying on your back on a bed of cold, wet pebbles. The sound of the surf is a dull roar in your ears, and for the first time in 16 days, the ground beneath you is not moving. You look up at the towering, snow-covered mountains of South Georgia, their peaks lost in the swirling mist. You are alive, but your throat is on fire, and your hands are gnarled claws of frozen flesh. You look at the James Caird, battered and leaking on the shore, and you realize that it was more than a boat. It was a wooden lung that breathed for you when the ocean tried to drown you. You are 800 miles from Elephant Island, and between you and the whaling stations lie 30 miles of uncharted glaciers and mountains that no man has ever crossed. So, as we settle into the imaginary rock and spray of the Scotia Sea, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the precision of the desperate. It was a place where a sextant was a holy relic and a canvas deck was a miracle. They proved that the human spirit can navigate the most violent of voids as long as there is a steady hand on the tiller and a mind capable of seeing the sun through the thickest of clouds. After 16 days of being battered by the Southern Ocean, Shackleton and his crew had reached land, but they had not yet reached safety. They were on the uninhabited western coast of South Georgia Island, while the whaling stations and the hope of rescue lay on the eastern side. Between them stood a spine of mountains and glaciers that had never been mapped, let alone crossed. The great white silence had returned, but this time it was vertical. On May 19, 1916, Shackleton, Frank Worsley, and Tom Crean began a desperate 36-hour march across the interior. You would likely find the scale of this trek incomprehensible. They were 3 men with no climbing gear, no sleeping bags, and only 50 feet of rope, attempting to conquer an alpine wilderness that modern explorers would only attempt with specialized equipment. The primary obstacle was the topography of the uncharted interior. South Georgia is essentially a drowned mountain range, with peaks rising to nearly 9,000 feet and glaciers that flow directly into the sea. The men had no map. They relied entirely on a general sense of direction and the instinct of the Highland climber. They carried only a small Primus stove, 3 days' rations of concentrated food, and the ship's carpenter's adze, which they used as a makeshift ice axe to improve their traction on the slick blue ice of the glaciers. They took screws from the James Caird and drove them through the soles of their leather boots. This was a minimalist assault on a landscape of maximum hostility. A defining moment of the crossing was the slide of desperation. After ascending a steep, razor-backed ridge in the dark, the men found themselves at the edge of a precipice with the mist closing in. They knew they could not survive the night at that altitude. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and they had no shelter. Shackleton made a decision that defied all logic of mountain safety. They would slide. They coiled their 50 feet of rope into a mat, sat on it together, Shackleton in front, Worsley in the middle, and Crean behind, and launched themselves into the dark void. They descended nearly 1,500 feet in a matter of seconds, a controlled fall through the snow that could have ended in a crevasse or a rock wall. Instead, they landed in a soft snowbank at the base of the ridge, shaking but alive. The great white silence was momentarily broken by the sound of their own frantic laughter. The physics of the glacier navigation required a constant awareness of hidden dangers. They had to cross the great Husvik Glacier, a vast field of ice riddled with crevasses, deep vertical cracks, often hidden by thin snow bridges. The men were roped together, moving in a rhythmic, slow-motion crawl. If one man fell, the other two would have to dig their heels in to anchor him. The psychological strain of crevasse watching was exhausting. Every step was a gamble. The great white silence was the sound of the wind whistling over the cracks, a reminder that the ground beneath them was a shifting, living entity. They moved through a world of blue shadows and white peaks, guided only by the moon and their desperate need to find the other side. By the 32nd hour, they reached the final descent at Sramanis. As the sun began to rise on the second day, they heard a sound that was so alien it felt like a hallucination, a steam whistle. It was the 7 a.m. whistle from the whaling station at Stromness, signaling the start of the workday. It was the first sound of civilization they had heard in 18 months. However, the path down to the station was blocked by a vertical waterfall. Too exhausted to find another route, they lowered themselves directly through the freezing water, using their rope. They arrived at the outskirts of the station soaked to the bone, their clothes in rags, their faces blackened by soot and salt, and their hair matted into wild tangles. To the whalers who first saw them, they looked like spectral apparitions rising from the ice. The meeting at the manager's house was the social conclusion to a mechanical miracle. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean walked into the office of Thorolf Skirl, the station manager who had seen them off 2 years prior. Skirl did not recognize them. He saw 3 bedraggled tramps and asked, "Who the hell are you?" The leader stepped forward and simply said, "My name is Shackleton." The silence that followed was the most profound of the journey. In that moment, the scale of their survival was finally realized. The whalers, men who lived their lives in the harshest conditions on Earth, were moved to tears by the sight of the survivors. They provided the men with hot baths, fresh clothes, and a meal that Shackleton would later describe as the most beautiful experience of his life. The quirky yet haunting psychological element of the march was the third man factor. All 3 men later, independently, reported a strange sensation during the crossing, the feeling that there was a 4th person walking with them, an unseen presence that provided comfort and direction during their most desperate hours. Shackleton wrote, "It seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. This phenomenon, now well documented in extreme survival situations, was the mind's way of coping with the absolute isolation of the great white silence. It was as if the landscape itself had provided a companion to ensure they reached the end of the road. You find yourself standing on a ridge overlooking the Stromness harbor. Below you, the smoke rises from the chimneys, and the small boats move in the water. Behind you lies 30 miles of ice and rock that no human should have been able to cross. Your feet are numb, your heart is pounding, and the taste of the freezing waterfall is still in your mouth. You look at your companions, their eyes are hollow with fatigue, but they are fixed on the world of men below. You realize that the great white silence is finally behind you. You have crossed the mountain, you have crossed the sea, and now there is only one task left: to go back for the 22 men still waiting on the gravel beach of Elephant Island. So, as we settle into the imaginary steam and warmth of the whaling station, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the power of the final push. It was a place where a carpenter's tool became an ice axe, and a 50-foot rope became a lifeline. They proved that the human spirit can traverse the most impossible of terrains, as long as there is a whistle on the wind and a promise to those left behind that has yet to be kept. While Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean had reached the relative luxury of the Stromness whaling station, their victory was incomplete. For Shackleton, the great white silence was not a memory, but a ticking clock. 22 men remained on Elephant Island, living under the hull of the Stankham Wills, surviving on dwindling penguin rations and the hope of their leader's return. The mission now shifted from a battle against the elements to a battle against the logistics of the Southern Ocean. What followed was a 4-month odyssey across the sea, as Shackleton attempted 4 separate times to penetrate the fortress of ice that guarded the South Shetlands. You would likely find the frustration of this phase agonizing. It was a period of near misses and mechanical failures, where the ocean seemed determined to keep its prisoners. The first attempt began almost immediately. On May 23, 1916, only 3 days after arriving at the whaling station, Shackleton set out on a large whaler called the Southern Sky. The whalers, moved by the crew's story, had volunteered the ship and their labor. However, the Southern Sky was built for hunting whales in open water, not for battling the heavy pack. 60 miles from Elephant Island, they hit a wall of impenetrable ice. Without a reinforced hull, the ship was helpless. The great white silence of the pack was visible on the horizon, a shimmering white line that signaled no passage. Shackleton was forced to turn back to the Falkland Islands, his heart heavy with the realization that the ice was not retreating as the winter deepened. The second and third attempts were marked by the diplomacy of desperation. Shackleton appealed to the Uruguayan and Chilean governments for assistance. The second attempt utilized the Instituto de Pesca No. 1, a small trawler provided by Uruguay. Again, the ice proved too formidable. The third attempt involved the Ema, a wooden schooner fueled by oil and sail. This voyage was a nightmare of mechanical failure. The engine broke down, and the ship was battered by a series of gales that nearly dismasted her. For the men on the deck of the EMA, the great white noise was the sound of the rigging screaming in the wind and the rhythmic thud of the ship against the swell. Each time they were forced to retreat, Shackleton's anxiety grew. He knew that with every passing day, the men on Elephant Island were growing weaker. One must consider the physics of the ice seasons. By July and August, the southern hemisphere is in the depths of winter. The pack ice in the Weddell Sea and the Drake Passage expands, reaching its maximum extent. For Shackleton, this was a mathematical crisis. He needed a ship with enough power to break the ice, but enough speed to navigate the storms. The great white silence was now a biological threat. On Elephant Island, the penguins were migrating north, and the harvest that kept the 22 men alive was disappearing. The men under the boat were living on a diet of limpet soup and seaweed, their bodies slowly consuming themselves in the sub-zero cold. The fourth and final attempt was made possible by the Chilean tugboat Yelcho. Unlike the previous vessels, the Yelcho was an unlikely hero. It was a small, steel-hulled ship with no radio and no electric light, and it was certainly not an icebreaker. However, it had a determined captain, Luis Pardo, and it arrived during a rare opening in the weather. On August 25, 1916, the Yelcho steamed south from Punta Arenas. This time, the Great White Silence relented. The pack ice had been scattered by a strong westerly gale, leaving a clear lead toward Elephant Island. On August 30th, at 11:40 a.m., the lookout on the Yelcho sighted the jagged peaks of the island through the mist. The moment of sight at Point Wild was the emotional climax of the expedition. On the beach, the 22 men had just finished a lunch of boiled seal bones. They were in the process of shelling out the last of their food when they saw a tiny dot of smoke on the horizon. Frank Wild, who had maintained a miraculous level of discipline for 4 months, ordered the men to light a flare using their last remaining tin of kerosene. On the Yelcho, Shackleton stood at the bow with a pair of binoculars, his hands shaking as he counted the figures on the beach. As the ship drew closer, he saw them standing in a row. He shouted across the water, "Are you all well?" The reply came back, faint but clear. "We are all well, boss, but the cook has been sick." The quirky, yet vital element of the rescue was the order of departure. There was no time for long goodbyes or the packing of gear. Shackleton knew that the ice could close back in at any moment. The men were ferried to the Yelcho in small boats, leaving behind the snuggery and the 2 lifeboats that had been their only shelter for 128 days. Within an hour, every man was on board. The social structure of the camp dissolved into the mechanical reality of the ship. The Great White Silence of the island was left behind as the Yelcho turned north. Not a single man had been lost. It was a statistical miracle that defied the history of polar exploration. You find yourself sitting in the warm, cramped galley of the Yelcho. You are wrapped in a thick, dry wool blanket, and someone has just handed you a mug of hot cocoa. The liquid is so sweet and warm that it feels like a physical shock to your system. You look at your hands, they are still blackened with soot and scarred by frostbite, but they are no longer shaking with cold. You look at the 21 men around you. Some are crying, some are laughing, and some are simply staring at the floor in a state of shock. You realize that the Great White Silence has finally been broken. The rescue wasn't just a ship appearing on the horizon. It was the moment you realized that the world had not forgotten you. So, as we settle into the imaginary vibration of the engine and the warmth of the rescue ship, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the persistence of the searcher. It was a place where a small tugboat became a chariot and where a 4-month wait ended in a 1-hour scramble. They proved that no distance is too great and no ice is too thick as long as there is a leader who refuses to stop looking and a crew who refuses to stop hoping. When the Yelcho steamed into the harbor of Punta Arenas, Chile, on September 3, 1916, the 28 men of the Endurance were thrust into a world that had moved on without them. The Great White Silence was replaced by the cacophony of a world at war. The transition from the timeless, frozen desert of the Antarctic to the industrial and political chaos of the 20th century was a profound psychological shock. You would likely find this return to be the most disorienting phase of Ola biological whiplash, where the simple goal of survival was replaced by the complex demands of a society in the midst of its most violent conflict. The first reality they faced was the mechanical noise of the modern world. For nearly 2 years, the only sounds the men had heard were the wind, the ice, and the occasional bray of a penguin. In Punta Arenas, they were greeted by the shriek of steam whistles, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestones, and the roar of a cheering crowd that numbered in the thousands. The Great White Silence had been a sensory deprivation chamber. The return was a sensory assault. The men found themselves flinching at sudden noises and feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of faces. Shackleton, ever the public figure, had to immediately shift from the boss of a survival camp to a diplomat and celebrity, managing the press and the expectations of a public hungry for a story of heroism that did uninvolve the trenches of Europe. One of the most sobering elements was the discovery of the Great War. When the Endurance left South Georgia in 1914, the conflict in Europe was expected to be over by Christmas. Upon their return in late 1916, the men learned of the staggering scale of the slaughter, the Somme, Verdun, and the introduction of chemical warfare. The Great White Silence had protected them from the news of a world tearing itself apart. Many of the men found that friends and family members they had hoped to reunite with were already dead or missing in action. This created a strange sense of survivor's guilt. They had fought for their lives against nature, only to return to a world where millions were losing their lives to other men. The boring but vital truth is that for many of the crew, the Antarctic felt safer and more logical than the world they had returned to. The physiology of readaptation was a slow and often painful process. Their bodies, conditioned to a diet of seal blubber and penguin meat, struggled with the rich food of civilization. Many of the men suffered from digestive issues and a strange lethargy. They had to learn how to sleep in beds again. After months of sleeping on stones or thwarts, a soft mattress felt unstable and stifling. The Great White Silence remained in their lungs. The air of the city felt thick and dusty compared to the crystalline purity of the pack ice. Their frost-bitten limbs continued to ache in the damp heat of the South American spring. They were walking wounded, carrying the scars of a battle that most of the world could barely imagine. A critical part of the return was the disbandment of the Endurance family. For 22 months, their survival had depended on a total lack of privacy and a shared, communal purpose. Once back in London, the social structure dissolved. The sailors went back to the merchant navy. The scientists returned to their laboratories. Many of them immediately enlisted in the military. Shackleton himself was sent to the North Russian front to advise on cold weather logistics. The Great White Silence was the only thing they all still had in common, but they were now scattered across a globe at war. The bond that had been forged in the snuggery on Elephant Island was tested by the distance of normal life, yet they remained in constant contact for the rest of their lives, bound by a trauma that no one else could truly understand. The quirky, yet poignant legacy of the return was the ship's ghost in the ledger. For years after the expedition, Shackleton was haunted by the financial fallout of the journey. He had personal debts from the expedition that would take the rest of his life to manage. The Great White Silence had no price tag, but the rescue did. He spent much of his time on the lecture circuit, telling the story of the Endurance over and over again to pay back the men who had supported him. To the public, he was a hero. To himself, he was a man who had failed his primary mission of crossing the continent, but succeeded in his secondary mission of losing no one. This successful failure became the defining paradox of his life. The final psychological transition occurred with the call of the South. Despite the horrors they had endured, many of the men felt a strange, magnetic pullback to the Antarctic. In 1921, Shackleton organized one final expedition, the quest. many of the original Endurance crew including Worsley Wild and Macklin signed on immediately. They were seeking the great white silence once again, perhaps finding the world of men to be more taxing than the world of ice. It was during this final voyage that Shackleton died of a heart attack at South Georgia, the very place where his greatest trek had ended. He was buried there, amongst the whalers, his headstone facing south toward the white world that had defined him. You find yourself standing on the deck of a steamer, heading back toward England. The air is warm, and the sound of the engine is a steady, rhythmic thrum. You are wearing a clean suit and a stiff collar, but you feel like an actor in a play. You look at the wake of the ship, and for a split second, the foam looks like the pack ice of the Weddell Sea. You realize that you will never truly leave the great white silence. It is a part of your breathing, a part of the way you look at the horizon. You survived the ice, you survived the ocean, and you survived the mountain. You are a different kind of human now, one who knows exactly how much a person can endure before they break, and who knows that the most valuable thing in the world is not gold or fame, but the person standing next to you in the dark. So, as we settle into the imaginary murmur of the city and the fading light of the expedition, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the long shadow of survival. It was a place where the end of the journey was just the beginning of the remembering. They proved that the human spirit can return from the edge of the world, but it never returns entirely unchanged. The great white silence remains, a quiet, frozen anchor in the soul of everyone who has ever looked at the ice and refused to give up. While the story of the Endurance is often told as a saga of human grit, it was also a scientific mission of immense dedication. Among the 28 men were geologists, biologists, meteorologists, and physicists who, even as their world was literally splintering beneath them, continued to observe, measure, and record the great white silence. To these men, the Antarctic was not just a hostile void to be crossed, it was a giant, frozen laboratory. You would likely find their commitment to their work astonishing. The sight of a man standing in a blizzard to check a thermometer, or a biologist dredging for life in a freezing lead of water while the ship's hull groaned under the pressure of the ice. This section explores the data of the drift, the specific discoveries that helped map the invisible forces of the Southern Ocean. The primary scientific endeavor was the observation of the Weddell Sea gyre. Before the Endurance, very little was known about the movement of the ice pack in this region. By being frozen into the ice for 10 months, the ship became a passive sensory array. The navigator, Frank Worsley, and the meteorologist, Leonard Hussey, meticulously plotted their position every day. This data provided the first comprehensive map of the clockwise current that circulates through the Weddell Sea. They discovered that the pack does not just drift randomly. It is driven by a complex interaction between the deep ocean currents and the prevailing winds. This great white movement explained why the ice was so much more treacherous here than in other parts of the Antarctic, as the gyre continuously forces the ice against the continental landmass, creating the terrifying pressure ridges that eventually destroyed the ship. The biologists on board, specifically Robert Clark, were focused on the life beneath the ice ceiling. Even when the ship was trapped, Clark continued to lower nets and dredges through holes cut in the ice. He discovered a surprisingly vibrant ecosystem thriving in the sub-zero water. He found species of icefish that possessed a natural antifreeze in their blood, and a variety of amphipods and krill that formed the base of the Antarctic food chain. The great white silence above was deceptive. Below the ice, there was a constant, shimmering migration of life. Clark's meticulous samples, many of which were lost when the ship sank, provided early evidence of how life adapts to extreme cold and darkness. His work helped establish the Weddell Sea as one of the most biologically productive regions of the Southern Ocean. Meteorology was perhaps the most vital science for the crew's immediate survival, led by Leonard Hussey. He maintained a chronicle of the atmospheric pulse, using barometers, anemometers, and thermometers. He recorded the weather every 2 hours, day and night. This data helped define the Antarctic climate system. Hussey observed the phenomenon of katabatic winds, the heavily cold air that rushes down from the high interior of the continent toward the sea at hurricane speeds. He also studied the optical etiquette of the ice, such as the Fata Morgana complex mirages. An ice blinks the reflection of distant ice on the underside of clouds. These observations were not just boring statistics. They were the only way to predict the movement of the pack and the potential opening of leads that might allow for escape. The geologist, James Wordie, focused on the petrology of the deep drift. He collected rocks and gravel that had been picked up by the ice as it scraped against distant, unseen coastlines. By analyzing these fragments, Wordie could make blind deductions about the geology of the Antarctic interior, which remained hidden beneath miles of ice. He looked for evidence of minerals, fossils, and tectonic history. Even when they abandoned the ship and moved to the ice floes, Wordie insisted on carrying his rock samples. Shackleton eventually had to order him to abandon the heavy collection to save weight, a moment that was scientifically heartbreaking but physically necessary. However, the notes Wordie kept allowed future geologists to understand the subglacial foundation of the continent. A fascinating, though grim, scientific study was the physiology of the Antarctic fast. The ship's surgeons, Macklin and McElroy, acted as unofficial human biologists. They monitored the effects of the extreme cold, the lack of sunlight, and the high-fat diet on the crew. They noted the onset of ice blindness caused by the glare of the snow and the psychological effects of the 4-month-long polar night. Their observations provided early insights into seasonal affective disorder and the limits of human thermoregulation. The Great White Silence was a stress test for the human body, and the doctor's records of how the men maintained their strength on seal blubber and penguin meat became a foundational text for later polar explorers and nutritional scientists. The quirky, yet essential, scientific tool of the expedition was the deep-sea sounding machine. To measure the depth of the ocean beneath the ice, the crew used a heavy lead weight on a wire. This was a grueling task, requiring the men to manually winch up thousands of feet of wire through the freezing air. These soundings revealed that the Weddell Sea was unexpectedly depth over 10,000 feet in some places, contradicting earlier theories that it was a shallow shelf. The Great White Silence sat atop a massive abyss, a realization that added to the men's sense of isolation. Each sounding was a data point that helped flesh out the bathymetry of the Southern Ocean, turning a blank space on the map into a geological reality. You find yourself helping James Wordie as he leans over a hole in the ice, his face red from the wind. He is pulling a wet, heavy rope up from the darkness, and you can see the excitement in his eyes as a small, translucent crustacean appears in the net. Around you, the ice is a flat, blinding white, but Wordie is talking about the evolutionary wonders of the deep. You realize that for these men, the science was a shield against despair. It gave the great white silence a purpose and a structure. They weren't just waiting to be rescued. They were observing. You look at the thermometer hanging from a tripod, its red line hovering far below zero, and you realize that every number recorded in Hussey's logbook was a small victory of the human mind over the chaotic power of the Antarctic. So, as we settle into the imaginary scratch of the pencil in a damp logbook and the rhythmic clink of the sounding machine, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the curiosity of the trapped. It was a place where a rock was a treasure and a weather reading was a prophecy. They proved that the human intellect can remain curious even when the body is freezing, and that the great white silence has 1,000 stories to tell to anyone with the patience to measure the wind and watch the ice. To understand the atmosphere of the Endurance during the long months of entrapment, one must acknowledge the 70 additional members of the crew who lived on the deck and, later, on the ice itself. These were the Canadian and Patagonian sled dogs, massive, thick-furred crossbreeds of huskies, mastiffs, and wolves, originally intended to haul tons of supplies across the Antarctic continent. These animals became the psychological and social anchors of the expedition. You would likely find the relationship between the men and the dogs to be one of the most poignant elements of the great white silence. In a world without color or external life, the dogs provided warmth, companionship, and a sense of duty that kept the men's minds from drifting into the abyss of isolation. The primary structure of the dogs' lives was the organization of the dog loos. When the ship was first frozen into the pack, the dogs were moved off the wooden decks and onto the ice. Each dog was given a dog lua, small shelter built from blocks of frozen snow and ice lined with straw. These shelters were arranged in neat rows alongside the ship, creating a literal suburb on the frozen sea. The dogs were divided into 6 teams, each assigned to a specific handler. This created a secondary social hierarchy within the crew. The handlers, including the biologist Robert Clark and the photographer Frank Hurley, became fiercely protective of their teams. The great white silence was constantly broken by the chorused rhythmic, collective howling of 70 dogs at the moon, a sound that Shackleton found both eerie and strangely comforting, as it signaled the health and spirit of his engines. One must consider the physics of the sledge training. Throughout the winter of 1915, the dogs were not idle. Shackleton insisted on daily exercise and training runs. The men would harness the teams to heavy wooden sledges and race them across the pressure ridges and flat plains of the pack. This was a vital mechanical rehearsal for the transcontinental journey that never came. The men learned the complex physics of dog driving, the specific commands needed to steer a team without reins, and the art of balancing a sledge over jagged ice. The dogs possessed an incredible power-to-weight ratio, capable of pulling twice their own body weight for hours in sub-zero temperatures. These training runs were the only time the men left the immediate vicinity of the ship, providing a much-needed sense of movement in a world that was physically stuck. The diet of the dogs was a study in blubber metabolism. Like the men, the dogs were eventually forced to live off the land. Their primary fuel was seal meat and blubber. The dogs thrived on this high-fat diet. Their thick coats became oily and waterproof, and they put on layers of insulating fat. The great white silence of the camp was often defined by the feeding hour, a chaotic and loud ritual where the handlers distributed chunks of frozen seal. The dogs' digestive systems were incredibly efficient, allowing them to sleep in the snow in temperatures 40 degrees below zero without losing body heat. They became biological radiators. A man could sit amongst the dogs in a blizzard and feel the heat radiating from their huddles. As the Endurance began to break up, the dog's role shifted from potential transport to actual salvage. When the order came to abandon ship, the dogs were the primary movers of the supplies. They hauled the lifeboats, the tents, and the remaining crates of food across the treacherous, shifting ice to ocean camp. Without the dogs, the men would have been unable to move even a fraction of the gear needed for survival. The dogs moved with a primal, focused energy, seemingly unaware of the danger as the ice groaned and buckled beneath their paws. They were the mechanical bridge between the dying ship and the temporary safety of the floe. However, the story of the dogs has a grim biological conclusion. As the months on the drifting ice turned into a year, the economy of the crumb became absolute. Shackleton was faced with a heartbreaking mathematical reality. There was not enough seal meat to feed both 28 men and 70 large dogs. Furthermore, the dogs could not be taken in the small, open lifeboats when the time came to sail for land. Between January and April 1916, Shackleton made the agonizing decision to have the dogs shot. This was perhaps the lowest point of morale for the entire crew. To kill the animals that had been their companions, their protectors, and their engines felt like a betrayal of the expedition's soul. The great white silence that followed the loss of the dogs was a heavy, mourning quiet that many of the men never forgot. The quirky yet touching legacy of the dogs was the naming etiquette. Every dog had a distinct personality and a name that reflected the men's humor and longings. There was Shakespeare, Hercules, Satan, and Mrs. Chippy, who was, famously, the carpenter's cat, though she lived and died among the dogs. The men treated the dogs as equals in the struggle. In the evenings, handlers would sit in the dogloos, talking to their teams as if they were old friends. This cross-species bond was a psychological shield. The dogs didn't care about the sinking ship or the failed mission. They only cared about the next meal and the hand on their head. By focusing on the boring daily needs of the dogs, the men were able to ignore, for a few hours, the terrifying reality of their own situation. You find yourself standing in the suburb of Dogloos, under a sky filled with the aurora australis. The air is so cold it hurts to breathe, but you are sitting next to a massive, sleeping husky named Wolf. You can feel the rhythmic thump-thump of his tail against the snow and the steam rising from his fur. The great white silence is all around you, but the dog is a warm, breathing anchor. You realize that in this frozen void, life is the only thing that matters, not the maps. Not the goals of the empire, but the simple, shared warmth of another living creature. You feel a profound sense of gratitude for these beasts of burden who have asked for nothing but a scrap of seal and a place to sleep in the wind. So, as we settle into the imaginary howl of the pack and the soft crunch of paws on frozen snow, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the partnership between man and animal. It was a place where 70 dogs were the heartbeat of a camp, and where their loss was the hardest price to pay for survival. They proved that the human spirit needs more than just food and shelter to endure. It needs the companionship of the wild to remind it that it is still alive, even in the heart of the great white silence. While the men of the Endurance struggled with the physical weight of the ice, one man was obsessed with its light. Frank Hurley, the expedition's official photographer and cinematographer, was a man of relentless energy and technical brilliance. His task was to document the journey for the world. But as the ship became a wreck and the mission turned into a siege, his work transformed into a haunting visual record of the Great White Silence. You would likely find the technical difficulty of his work almost impossible to fathom, operating heavy glassplate cameras in sub-zero temperatures, mixing volatile chemicals in a freezing darkroom, and risking his life to capture a single frame of a dying ship. This section examines the physics of polar photography, the mechanical ingenuity required to freeze time in a world that wanted to erase everything. The primary challenge was the chemistry of the sub-zero darkroom. To develop his photographs on the ship, Hurley had to convert a small cabin into a darkroom. In the Antarctic winter, the chemical solutions would freeze solid within minutes. He had to heat the developing tanks over a small oil stove, maintaining a precise temperature while the ship groaned and tilted around him. The Great White Silence outside was matched by a cramped, chemical-scented silence inside. Hurley used the Paget process, an early form of color photography that required a specialized screen of colored filters. This allowed him to capture the deep blues of the ice and the orange glow of the midnight sun, providing the world with its first true glimpse of the Antarctic's spectral palette. One must consider the aesthetics of the flashlight masterpiece. During the 4-month polar night, Hurley faced a world of total darkness. To photograph the Endurance trapped in the pack, he orchestrated an incredible feat of light painting. He set up 20 separate flash powder stations around the ship, connected by wires to a single trigger. When the powder ignited, it created a massive, momentary burst of light equivalent to thousands of modern camera flashes, illuminating the ship against the black Antarctic sky. The result was a series of ghostly, high-contrast images that made the ship look like a cathedral of ice. The Great White Silence was momentarily shattered by the boom of the powder and a blinding white glare, leaving behind a permanent record of a moment that otherwise would have been lost to the shadows. The transition from the ship to the ice required the logistics of salvage and sacrifice. When Shackleton gave the order to abandon the Endurance, Hurley was faced with a heartbreaking decision. He had nearly 500 glassplate negatives, weighing hundreds of pounds, too heavy to carry across the shifting ice. Together with Shackleton, Hurley sat in the snow and went through the collection, piece by piece. They smashed nearly 400 plates to ensure no one would ever be tempted to go back for them, selecting only the 120 most vital images to save. Hurley also managed to save a small Kodak vest pocket camera and several rolls of film, which he tucked inside his parka. This act of curatorial destruction ensured that the remaining images were the absolute essence of the expedition's ordeal. The mechanical difficulty of cinematography in the wind cannot be overstated. Hurley carried a heavy, hand-cranked, press-twitch movie camera. In the extreme cold, the lubricating grease in the gears would thicken like tar, making it impossible to turn the handle. Hurley had to strip the camera of all oil and run the gears dry, which risked metal-on-metal friction. Furthermore, the film itself, made of celluloid, became brittle and would snap like dry leaves in the sub-zero air. He had to breathe on the film gates to provide just enough warmth to keep the reel moving. His footage of the Endurance being slowly crushed by the ice is some of the most dramatic documentary film ever captured, showing the masts collapsing and the hull splintering in a slow, agonizing death rattle. A critical and often overlooked element was the social utility of the photograph. Hurley's work was not just for history, it was for the men's morale. In the dim light of the snuggery on Elephant Island, Hurley would show the men his prints or talk about the scenes he had captured. The images provided a sense of witness. They validated the men's suffering, turning their private agony into a public record. The great white silence was a void that threatened to swallow their identities. Hurley's camera was a tool for reclamation. By capturing their faces sooted, frostbitten, but defiant, he gave them a way to see themselves as heroes rather than victims. The quirky, yet miraculous, survival of the canister of time is a story in itself. Hurley packed his precious 120 glass plates into specialized, soldered tin boxes to protect them from the salt water and the ice. These canisters were hauled over the pressure ridges, survived the swamping of the lifeboats, and were buried in the frozen gravel of Elephant Island for 4 months. When they were finally opened in London a year later, the plates were in perfect condition. The Great White Silence had been successfully bottled and transported across the world. These images remain the primary way we visualize the expedition today. Without Hurley's technical obsession, the Endurance would be a legend, but because of him, it is a haunting, visible reality. You find yourself standing on a hummock of ice, watching Frank Hurley as he adjusts the tripod of his massive plate camera. The wind is biting at your skin, and the ship is a tangle of broken wood a few hundred yards away. You see Hurley duck under a black cloth, his hands moving with a precise, mechanical grace despite the cold. He is not just taking a picture. He is extracting a moment from the ice. You hear the click of the shutter, a tiny sound in the vast Great White Silence, and you realize that he has just captured a piece of your life that will outlive the ship, the mission, and perhaps even the men themselves. You feel a strange sense of immortality in that click, the knowledge that someone, a century from now, will see the ice exactly as you see it now. So, as we settle into the imaginary glow of the darkroom and the sharp scent of developer, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the power of the image. It was a place where a glass plate was worth more than a bag of gold, and where light was the only thing that could escape the gravity of the pack. They proved that even in the heart of the Great White Silence, the human eye seeks to find beauty and order, and that a single frame of film can hold enough truth to inspire a world. In the history of polar exploration, the greatest predator was often not the cold or the wind, but a quiet, internal erosion called scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C. It had decimated the crews of many previous expeditions, turning men's bones brittle and their spirits to ash. However, the men of the Endurance remained remarkably healthy throughout their 2-year ordeal. This was not a matter of luck, but of a forced, biological adaptation to the Great White Silence. To survive, they had to abandon the traditional European maritime diet of salted pork and hardtack and embrace the nutritional chemistry of the Antarctic itself. You would likely find the diet of the ice to be a grueling test of the Paleta monotonous cycle of oily, dark meats and heavy fats that transformed their bodies into efficient, cold-resistant machines. The primary pillar of their survival was the biochemistry of fresh meat. Early 20th century medicine was only just beginning to understand the role of vitamins, but Shackleton and his surgeons, Macklin and McElroy, knew from experience that fresh meat was the only cure for scurvy. The Weddell Sea provided a steady supply of Weddell seals and crabiter seals. Unlike cooked or preserved meats, fresh seal meat contains trace amounts of vitamin C, particularly in the liver, brain, and heart. By consuming the animals nearly raw or lightly hushed stewed, the men were unknowingly performing a daily medical intervention. The Great White Silence was a desert of plants, but it was a forest of protein. The men moved from a grain-based civilization to a carnivorous one, where every bite was a brick in the wall of their immunity. One must consider the physics of blubber as fuel, in temperatures that frequently dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The human body becomes a furnace that requires an immense amount of kindling. A standard caloric intake of 2,500 calories per day was insufficient. The men needed 5,000 to 6,000 calories just to maintain their body weight. The only source of such dense energy was seal blubber. Blubber is a layer of vascularized fat that is incredibly rich in lipids. The men would fry chunks of meat in the blubber or eat it straight when the stoves were low. This high-fat diet altered their metabolism, allowing them to generate the internal thermogenesis necessary to sleep in frozen tents. The Great White Silence was countered by an internal fire fueled by the very animals that thrived in the cold. The social and culinary centerpiece of the day was the hush ritual. Hush was a thick, highly concentrated stew made by melting blocks of pemmican, a commercial explorer's ration, consisting of 60% lard and 40% ground beef into a pot of water, then adding chunks of fresh seal or penguin. The cook, Charles Green, became a master of the hush, varying the consistency depending on the available fuel. The steam from the pot was often the only warmth the men felt all day. The Great White Silence was momentarily broken by the rhythmic scraping of spoons against tin mugs. This meal was more than nutrition. It was a psychological anchor. The heavy, greasy warmth of the hush provided a temporary sense of fullness that allowed the men to face the long, dark hours of the polar night. As the supplies from the ship dwindled, the men entered the era of the penguin. While seal was the preferred meat for its fat content, Adelie and Gentoo penguins provided a lean, gamey alternative. The meat of a penguin is dark, almost black, and has a flavor described as a cross between beef, dark meat, chicken, and fishy duck. The men had to develop a clinical efficiency in skinning the birds, as the feathers and skin were used for fuel, while the breast meat was saved for the pot. The Great White Silence was often the backdrop to the penguin hunt, a task that was both vital and repetitive. The men learned to appreciate the subtle differences in texture between the species, a boring but essential skill that kept the monotony of the diet from becoming a psychological burden. A critical, and often difficult, element was the crisis of fuel water. To eat, one must first drink, and in the Antarctic, every drop of water requires the expenditure of fuel. The men had to melt snow and ice over blubber-fueled stoves. This created a permanent state of mild dehydration, as the process was slow and the yield was low. The Great White Silence was the sound of ice hissing on a hot plate. To save fuel, they often drank slush, half-melted snow that was gritty and bitingly cold. This lack of water made the high-protein diet even harder on their kidneys. The men's urine would turn a dark, concentrated amber, and their thirst became a constant companion, especially during the long days of pulling sledges or rowing lifeboats. The quirky, yet vital, supplement to this diet was the sledge biscuit. These were hard, square crackers made of wheat flour, salt, and fat, designed to be nearly indestructible. Each man was rationed a specific number per day. These biscuits became the currency of the camp. Men would trade chores for a half biscuit or use them to play games of chance. The Great White Silence was the background to the biscuit audit, where every crumb was meticulously accounted for. When the ship sank, the salvage of the biscuit tins was treated with the same reverence as the salvage of the lifeboats. These dry, tasteless squares were the last link to the world of agriculture, a crunchy reminder of the fields of England in a world made of frozen salt water. You find yourself sitting in the snuggery on Elephant Island, holding a warm tin mug of penguin hush. The liquid is dark and oily, with small globules of yellow fat floating on the surface. The smell is a pungent mix of wet wool, soot, and scorched meat. As you take a sip, you feel the warmth spread from your throat to your chest, a slow-burning fuel that keeps the great white silence at bay. You look at your companions, their faces blackened by blubber smoke, and you realize that your body has become a part of the Antarctic cycle. You are no longer an intruder. You are a predator, fueled by the sea and the ice. You feel a strange, primal realization that as long as the seals and penguins remain, the silence cannot claim you. So, as we settle into the imaginary clink of the spoon and the scent of the blubber stove, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the chemistry of survival. It was a place where luxury was a piece of liver and wealth was a full biscuit tin. They proved that the human body can adapt to the most alien of diets as long as there is a cook to stir the pot, and a leader to ensure that every man gets his fair share of the hush. To survive the great white silence, one had to exist within a microenvironment of trapped air. In 1914, the technology of warmth was not found in synthetic fibers or electric heaters, but in the intelligent layering of natural materials, wool, fur, and tightly woven cotton. The men of the Endurance were essentially biological engines, wrapped in several layers of insulation, designed to manage the delicate physics of heat retention and moisture evaporation. You would likely find the weight and texture of their clothing to be a sensory burden, perpetual state of being bundled in heavy, scratchy, and often damp fabrics that became a second skin over the 2-year journey. This section examines the materials science of polar dress, the specific garments that stood between the human body and a world of absolute zero. The primary layer of defense was the architecture of wool. Every man was issued heavy Jaeger wool undergarments, including long johns and thick sweaters. Wool is a miracle of natural engineering. Its fibers are crimped, creating millions of tiny air pockets that trap body heat. More importantly, wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture without feeling wet to the touch, and continues to insulate even when damp. The social etiquette of the Great White Silence involved the woolen rotation men would wear their sweaters for months at a time, allowing the natural oils lanolin and the buildup of soot to create a wind-resistant patina. The itch of the wool was a constant background noise to their existence, a reminder of the barrier that kept their blood from freezing. One must consider the physics of Burberry windcloth. For their outer layer, the expedition used a specialized fabric developed by Thomas Burberry. This was not a heavy coat, but a lightweight, extremely tightly woven cotton gabardines. The secret was in the weave. The threads were so close together that they resisted the penetration of the biting Antarctic wind while still allowing internal perspiration to escape. Unlike modern waterproof gear, which can trap sweat and turn it into ice, Burberry cloth was breathable. During the sledging journeys, the men would wear these thin smocks over their wool, creating a windbreak that allowed them to move freely. The Great White Silence was the sound of the wind snapping against this taut cotton fabric, a rhythmic crack-crack like the sails of a ship. The most critical and specialized gear was the reindeer skin finnesko. For footwear, the men relied on traditional Sami boots made from the skin of a reindeer's legs. The fur was worn on the outside, and the boots were stuffed with Senegrassa-specific type of dried sedge grass from Norway. The grass acted as a renewable, absorbent insulation, wicking moisture away from the feet and trapping a layer of warm air. The physics of the finnesko was one of soft contact. Unlike stiff leather boots, these were flexible, allowing the foot to move and maintain circulation. The men had to become experts in the art of the grass, meticulously drying and teasing their boot fillers over the blubber stove every night. To have wet grass in your finnesko was a biological catastrophe that led directly to the black rot of frostbite. Hand protection was managed through the mitt versus glove debate. While gloves allowed for the dexterity needed to operate a sextant or a camera, they were lethal in extreme cold because they separated the fingers, increasing the surface area for heat loss. Shackleton's men primarily used wolfskin mitts, where the fingers stayed together to share warmth. These mitts were often hung around the neck on a lamp wick string, ensuring they wouldn't be lost in a gust of wind. The Great White Silence was often the backdrop to the numb finger dance, where men would swing their arms violently in circles to use centrifugal force to drive blood back into their fingertips. The leather of the mitts would become greased with seal oil, turning them into stiff, waterproof paddles that smelled of old fat. The final layer of survival was the reindeer skin sleeping bag. Each man was originally issued a bag made from the hide of a young reindeer, with the fur turned inward. These bags were incredibly warm, but had a major mechanical flaw. They were moisture traps. During the night, the moisture from a man's breath and skin would condense and freeze within the fur. Over weeks of use, a bag that originally weighed 12 pounds could absorb enough ice to weigh nearly 30 pounds. When they moved to the snuggery on Elephant Island, the bags became sodden, rotting masses of hair and ice. The men had to thaw their way into their bags every night, using their own body heat to melt the frozen reindeer skin until it became pliable enough to crawl inside. The quirky, yet vital accessory was the balaclava and the goggles. The head is a major site of heat loss, and the wool balaclava was the soldier's helmet of the Antarctic. It covered everything but the eyes and mouth. To prevent snow blindness, a painful burning of the cornea caused by UV rays reflecting off the ice, the men wore goggles made of tinted glass or wood with thin horizontal slits. The Great White Silence was viewed through a narrow, darkened window. The moisture from their breath would often freeze onto the wool of the balaclava, creating a mask of ice around their faces that had to be carefully cracked off to prevent skin tears. This layer of ice, ironically, acted as a further windbreak, a shell of frozen breath protecting the skin beneath. You find yourself sitting in the dark of a tent, pulling on your thick Jaeger socks. The wool is coarse and smells of wood smoke and seal. You slide your feet into the finnesko, feeling the dry crunch of the sennegrass as it cushions your toes. You pull on your Burberry smock, and as you step out into the Great White Silence, you feel the wind hit the fabric. It doesn't penetrate, it simply slides over you. You are a walking thermos, a collection of layers designed to keep the fire of your life from being blown out by the polar air. You realize that your clothing is not just fabric. It is a mechanical system, a set of boring but vital boundaries that define the difference between a survivor and a statue of ice. So, as we settle into the imaginary scratch of the wool, and the snap of the cotton. Remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the engineering of the envelope. It was a place where a handful of grass was a treasure and a tight weave was a shield. They proved that the human body can endure the most hostile temperatures on Earth as long as it is wrapped in the wisdom of the natural world and the disciplined maintenance of its own trapped heat. In the great white silence, where the sun might disappear for months or hang in the sky for 24 hours without setting, the concept of time becomes a fluid and dangerous abstraction. Yet, for the leaders of the Endurance, time was a rigid, physical requirement. Without a precise knowledge of the hour, the minute, and the second, navigation across a featureless ocean or a shifting ice pack is impossible. This phase of the expedition was governed by the physics of horology, the science of measuring time through mechanical means. To survive, the men had to guard their chronometers and watches with more ferocity than their food. For a clock that lost a few seconds could result in a boat missing an island by dozens of miles. You would likely find the ritual of winding to be the most sacred and boring necessity of the entire journey. The primary tools of this temporal survival were the marine chronometers. These were large, high-precision clocks housed in brass cases and suspended on gimbals' pivoted supports that allowed the clock to remain level even as the ship tossed and turned. The Endurance carried several of these, manufactured by makers like Mercer and Smith. A chronometer is essentially a mechanical memory of London. It is set to Greenwich Mean Time and kept running perfectly. By comparing the local time determined by the position of the sun at noon with the time on the chronometer, a navigator can calculate his longitude. The great white silence was a void of space, and the ticking of the chronometer was the only thread connecting the men back to a specific point on the globe. One must consider the thermodynamics of the pocket watch. While the heavy chronometers stayed in the ship or the tents, the officers, Shackleton, Worsley, and Wild carried silver pocket watches for daily use. In the Antarctic, the cold is the enemy of the clock. Lubricating oils in the delicate gears can thicken or freeze, causing the watch to slow down or stop entirely. To prevent this, the men practiced the body heat protocol. They wore their watches in inner pockets, pressed directly against their wool undershirts, using their own metabolic warmth to keep the mechanical heart of the watch beating. The great white silence was measured by a ticking that lived against the skin, a mechanical companion that relied on human warmth to maintain its accuracy. The transition from the ship to the ice created a crisis of chronometer stability. When the Endurance sank, the heavy chronometers had to be moved to the ocean camp flow. Sudden jars or vibrations can disturb the delicate balance spring of a high-end clock, throwing off its calibration. The men had to carry these brass boxes across the bucking, grinding ice as if they were made of thin glass. On the ice, the clocks were placed on a stable platform, usually a wooden crate buried in the snow, to insulate it from temperature fluctuations. The great white silence was the background to the noon sight, where Worsley would stand with his sextant, waiting for the exact moment the sun reached its zenith, while another man stood by the chronometer to shout out the time. Navigation in the lifeboats was the ultimate test of the mechanical pulse. During the 800-mile journey of the James Caird, the spray and the salt were constant threats to the watches. Worsley kept his primary chronometer tucked inside his shirt, but even then, the moisture was relentless. He had to perform complex mental arithmetic to adjust the time based on the known rate of the watch, the few seconds it was known to gain or lose each day. This was the mathematics of the abyss. If the watch was off by just 1 minute, the resulting calculation of their position would be wrong by 15 miles. The Great White Silence was a landscape where a tiny gear slipping a single tooth could lead to a boatload of men drifting past South Georgia and into the empty Atlantic. A fascinating and boring necessity was the winding etiquette. A mechanical watch must be wound at the same time every day to maintain consistent tension in its mainspring. Shackleton made this a formal duty. Even when the men were starving, frostbitten, or exhausted, the watches were wound. This ritual provided a sense of civilized order in a world that had none. It was a daily declaration that the men still belonged to a world governed by hours and minutes. The Great White Silence was a place where time felt like it had stopped, but the rhythmic click-click of the winding key was a mechanical promise that the future still existed and was worth measuring. The quirky, yet miraculous, survival of the final watch is a symbol of the expedition's precision. When Shackleton and his 2 companions began their 36-hour march across the glaciers of South Georgia, they carried only the essentials. Among them was a single pocket watch. This watch allowed them to pace their efforts and, crucially, to know when they were close to the 7 a.m. whistle of the whaling station. When they finally walked into Stromness, they were on time. The Great White Silence had been traversed, and the mechanical pulse of the watch had remained steady throughout. Today, many of these watches are preserved in museums, their hands frozen in time. But their history remains a testament to the discipline of the men who refuse to let the cold stop their clocks. You find yourself sitting in a tent on the ice floe. It is the middle of the polar night, and the only light comes from a small blubber lamp. You hear a sound that is so regular and so small that it almost disappears into the Great White Silence, the rapid tick-tick-tick of a chronometer. You watch Frank Worsley as he opens the brass lid and carefully inserts a winding key. His movements are slow and reverent. You realize that this box is not just a clock. It is a map of where you have been and a compass for where you are going. You feel a strange sense of comfort in that sound. In a world where the ice can crush a ship and the wind can scream for days, the steady, mechanical heart of the clock is the only thing that remains unchanged. So, as we settle into the imaginary ticking of the brass and the rhythm of the winding key, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the stewardship of the second. It was a place where accuracy was a life-saving virtue, and where a pocket watch was a piece of the sun. They proved that the human spirit can maintain its direction even in the most featureless of voids, as long as it keeps its watch's wound and its eyes on the steady pulse of time. In the early 20th century, the Great White Silence was more than a metaphor. It was a physical barrier to the transmission of information. While the Endurance left London during the golden age of the wireless revolution, the reality of Antarctic communication was governed by the physics of radio propagation and the limitations of early spark gap technology. Shackleton had hoped to use wireless telegraphy to stay in contact with the world, but the Southern Ocean and the shifting ice had other plans. This phase of the expedition was defined by a mechanical isolation that is almost impossible to imagine in our modern, connected world. You would likely find the silence of the radio to be a source of profound psychological weight, the knowledge that you can listen to the world's heartbeat, but it cannot hear yours. The primary communication tool on the Endurance was the wireless telegraphy suite. This system consisted of a massive antenna array strung between the ship's masts and a spark gap transmitter in the cabin. This technology worked by creating a high-voltage electrical discharge across a small gap, which generated electromagnetic waves that traveled through the atmosphere. However, the efficiency of these waves was highly dependent on the ionospheric conditions, the state of the upper atmosphere. In the Antarctic, the aurora australis and the extreme magnetic fluctuations of the South Pole created a chaotic environment for radio waves. The Great White Silence was electrically charged, often absorbing or scattering the signals before they could reach the relay stations in the Falkland Islands or South America. One must consider the logistics of the Antarctic receiving station. Throughout the drift, the ship's wireless operator, Lionel Greenstreet, spent hours hunched over his headset, straining to hear the faint dits and daws of Morse code through a wall of static. Because the ship's batteries were needed for light and heat, the transmitter was rarely used. The focus was on receiving news. For a few months in 1915, the men were able to catch fragments of news from the war in Europe, brief, spectral bursts of information about battles in the North Sea or the fall of cities. These signals were like ghosts in the Great White Silence, providing a tenuous link to a world that was moving on without them. But the communication was one way. The Endurance lacked the power to push a signal back through the thousands of miles of ice and storm. The transition from the ship to the ice meant the death of the electrical link. When the masts of the Endurance were snapped by the ice, the antenna array was destroyed. The wireless equipment was far too heavy and fragile to be salvaged and moved across the pack. At that moment, the crew entered a state of absolute silence. They were no longer just lost. They were invisible to the world's electromagnetic spectrum. This silence had a specific social effect on the camp. Without the distraction of news or external voices, the men's world shrank to the size of their ice floe. The Great White Silence became a permanent acoustic cage. The only boring but vital communication left was the use of signal flags and flares, tools that required a direct line of Sita luxury rarely granted by the Antarctic blizzards. A critical and often overlooked element was the message in a bottle strategy. Shackleton, realizing that the world might never know their fate, prepared several records of the expedition's progress. These were written on parchment, sealed in tins or bottles, and buried at various points, including on Elephant Island. This was the most primitive form of communication, a reliance on the drift of the ocean to eventually carry their story to a human hand. The Great White Silence was the guardian of these secrets. It is a haunting thought that had the rescue failed, the only communication left of the 28 men would have been these small, sealed containers, waiting for decades in the frozen gravel to be discovered by a future explorer. The quirky, yet vital, social communication was the sledging journal. Since they could not talk to the world, the men talked to themselves. Almost every member of the expedition kept a detailed diary. These journals were the primary way the men processed the Great White Silence. They wrote about the weather, the food, their dreams, and their frustrations. These books were small, often the size of a handstand, were kept tucked inside their jackets to keep the ink from freezing. The act of writing was a mechanical ritual of self-preservation. By recording the boring details of their day, they were asserting that their time still mattered. These journals eventually became the radio signals of history, allowing us, a century later, to hear the voices that the Antarctic tried to silence. The final communication hurdle was the silence of the rescue. During the 4 months that the 22 men waited on Elephant Island, They had no way of knowing if Shackleton had reached South Georgia. They spent every day scanning the horizon, hoping for a visual signal, the smoke of a ship or the flash of a heliograph, a mirror used to reflect sunlight. The great white silence on the island was absolute. When the Yelcho finally appeared, it didn't communicate by radio. It communicated by its physical presence. The first message received by the men was the sight of the Chilean flag and the sound of the ship's whistle. The silence was broken, not by a wire, but by the return of the human voice across the water. You find yourself standing on the deck of the Endurance on a clear, cold night. You see the wireless operator, his face illuminated by the faint blue spark of the transmitter as he tests the equipment. The sound is a sharp crack, like a whip hitting the air. You look up at the antenna wires, which are encrusted with frost, stretching between the masts like a spiderweb. You realize that you are trying to scream into a void that is too big to hear you. The great white silence is not just the absence of sound, it is the absence of a receiver. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature, the realization that you are on a different planet, and the only bridge back is a fragile spark that is about to go out forever. So, as we settle into the imaginary crackle of the static and the scratch of a pencil on a frozen page, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the resilience of the isolated. It was a place where a diary was a lifeline and a signal flare was a prayer. They proved that the human spirit can maintain its connection to reality even when the wires are cut, as long as there is a story worth writing and a companion to hear it told. In the great white silence, a minor infection or a broken bone was not merely an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. The men of the Endurance were served by two surgeons, Dr. Alexander Macklin and Dr. James McElroy, who maintained a mobile, 19th-century medical theater in the most improbable conditions. Their pharmacy was a collection of glass bottles and tinctures housed in a wooden chest, and their operating table was often a pile of packing crates or the damp floor of an upturned boat. You would likely find the medicine of the ice to be a gritty, mechanical struggler world of chloroform, carbolic acid, and the sheer physical strength required to hold a patient steady in a freezing gale. This section examines the surgical logistics of survival, the specific tools and treatments that kept 28 men intact when their environment was trying to pull them apart. The primary defense was the pharmacy of the standard chest. The expedition carried a comprehensive medical kit supplied by Burroughs Wellcome & Co., containing tabloid brand medications. These were some of the first standardized, compressed pills in history, allowing a vast range of treatments to be carried in a small space. The chest included opium-based painkillers, laudanum, caffeine for exhaustion, quinine for fevers, and silver nitrate for cauterizing wounds. The great white silence was a sterile environment in terms of germs, but the cold and the diet created their own pathologies. The doctors spent much of their time treating constipation of the ice, a result of the high-protein, low-fiber seal diet, using cascara and calomel. These small, chalky tablets were the boring but essential chemicals that maintained the internal equilibrium of the crew. One must consider the physics of Antarctic anesthesia. In the pre-electronic era, surgeries were performed using chloroform or ether. Both chemicals are highly volatile and difficult to manage in sub-zero temperatures. To administer chloroform, the doctors used a Schimmelbusch Masco wire frame covered with gauze, placed over the patient's nose and mouth. The doctor would drop the liquid chloroform onto the gauze, and the patient would inhale the evaporating gas. In the snuggery on Elephant Island, This was a terrifying procedure. The doctors had to ensure that the patient didn't freeze while unconscious, as the anesthesia lowered the body's ability to regulate heat. The great white silence was momentarily replaced by the heavy, sweet scent of chloroform and the labored, rhythmic breathing of a man hovering between life and death. The most dramatic medical event was the amputation on the gravel. The youngest stowaway, Perce Blackborough, had suffered severe frostbite during the lifeboat journey to Elephant Island. By the time they landed, his toes had developed wet gangrena bacterial infection that causes tissue to die and rot. Without antibiotics, the only treatment was the mechanical removal of the dead flesh. On June 15, 1916, in the dim, smoky interior of the upturned boats, Macklin and McElroy performed the amputation. They used a small surgical saw and a set of scalpels, working by the flickering light of a blubber lamp. The great white silence outside was a blizzard, but inside, the focus was on the boring precision of the bone saw. The surgery was a success, a testament to the doctor's ability to maintain a sterile field in a room filled with penguin soot. A critical and constant task was the management of snow blindness. The intense ultraviolet radiation reflecting off the white landscape can literally burn the surface of the eye, causing a condition called featureless. To the men, it felt like having hot sand rubbed into their sockets. The doctors treated this using zinc and cocaine eye drops. The cocaine acted as a local anesthetic to dull the agonizing pain, while the zinc served as an antiseptic. The great white silence was a visual hazard, and the doctors were the guardians of the men's sight. They also improvised eye patches using tea leaves or pieces of dark silk to keep the light out while the cornea healed. This was a mechanical repair of the eye, allowing the men to return to the essential tasks of hunting and bailing. The boring but vital science of ice dentistry was another responsibility. The extreme cold and the hard sledge biscuits were brutal on the men's teeth. Fillings would fall out as the tooth enamel contracted in the cold, and abscesses were common. The doctors carried tooth keys and dental forceps to extract teeth that were beyond repair. There was no gentle way to do this. It was a matter of leverage and grip. A man would sit on a crate, leaning his head back, while the doctor applied the metal tool to the tooth. The great white silence was broken by the crunch of the extraction. These procedures were carried out without anesthesia unless the case was severe, as the precious chloroform was saved for life-threatening surgeries. The quirky, yet life-saving, medical tool was the clinical thermometer. In an era before infrared sensors, the glass mercury thermometer was the only way to measure a man's internal temperature. The doctors were obsessed with hypothermia monitoring. They knew that once a man's core temperature dropped below a certain point, his heart would become unstable. During the lifeboat journeys, Macklin would move between the men, checking their pulses and temperatures. He looked for the apathy of the colda psychological state, where a man simply stops caring if he lives or dies. This was the great white silence entering the mind. The doctor's job was to use medical aggression, forcing hot hush down a man's throat, or making him move his limbs to restart the biological engine. You find yourself lying on a pile of sealskins in the snuggery. You can hear the clink of metal instruments against a tin tray as Dr. Macklin prepares a dressing. The room is so dark you can barely see your own hands, but the smell of carbolic acid is a sharp, clean reminder of the world you left behind. You feel the doctor's hands cold but steady as he checks your pulse. He doesn't say much. He is focused on the boring mechanics of your health. You realize that these two men are the only thing standing between you and the great white silence of the grave. You feel a profound sense of trust in the small glass bottles and the sharp steel blades. You are not just a survivor. You are a patient in the world's most remote hospital. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the pharmacy and the steady hand of the surgeon, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the maintenance of the machine. It was a place where a small pill was a miracle and a bone saw was a tool of hope. They proved that the human body can be repaired and preserved even in the heart of the void, as long as there are those with the skill to heal and the courage to operate by the light of a flickering lamp. In the great white silence, a map is not a static picture of the world, but a living, breathing document that must be recalculated every hour. For the men of the Endurance, the very concept of place was fluid. They were positioned on a massive sheet of ice that was drifting over an unmapped ocean floor, while the stars, their only reliable landmarks, were often hidden by a veil of frozen mist. To navigate, they had to rely on the physics of magnetism and geometry, using tools that were designed for stable ground, but forced to function in a landscape of constant motion. This section explores the logistics of the chart, the specific methods used to turn a featureless void into a navigable path toward survival. The primary instrument of this spatial awareness was the liquid-damped marine compass. Unlike a simple dry needle compass, a marine compass has its needle mounted on a card, floating in a bowl of alcohol and water. This fluid dampens the oscillations, allowing the needle to remain steady even as the ship or the ice floe vibrates and tilts. However, in the Antarctic, the compass faces a unique mechanical challenge: magnetic dip. Because they were so close to the South Magnetic Pole, the magnetic lines of force were pulling the needle downward rather than horizontally. The men had to use counterweights or specific internal adjustments to keep the compass card from dragging against the glass. The great white silence was a magnetic storm, and the compass was the only tool that could feel the invisible pull of the Earth's core. One must consider the mathematics of dead reckoning. When the sun and stars were obscured, the navigator, Frank Worsley, had to estimate their position based on their last known point, their speed, and their direction. This is a boring but vital exercise in cumulative probability. On the ice, speed was measured by the drift movement of the pack caused by the wind. Worsley would observe the leeway of the ice, calculating how many miles a 20-knot wind would push a billion-ton ice field. The great white silence was a conveyor belt, and dead reckoning was the only way to track their progress. This required a meticulous logbook where every change in wind direction was recorded, turning the chaos of the weather into a series of geometric vectors on a paper chart. The transition to the lifeboats introduced the physics of the bubble sextant. A standard sextant requires the navigator to bring the sun down to a clear, sharp horizon. In the Southern Ocean, the horizon is rarely sharp. It is a chaotic blur of gray water and white spray. To solve this, navigators sometimes used an artificial horizon, a small trough of mercury that provided a perfectly level, reflecting surface. However, on a tossing boat like the James Caird, mercury was impossible to use. Worsley had to rely on a bubble or a spirit level attached to his sextant, which gave him a mechanical reference for the vertical. The great white silence was a world of tilted planes, and the bubble was the only thing that knew which way was truly up. A critical and often overlooked tool was the protractor and the parallel rule. These were the mechanical bridges between the observation and the map. Once Worsley had his sight, he had to plot it on a paper chart using these tools to draw precise lines of position. In the snuggery on Elephant Island, or in the bottom of a wet lifeboat, this was a struggle against the elements. The paper was often damp and soft, and the pencil lead would snap in the cold. The great white silence was a landscape that defied lines, yet Worsley's charts were covered in them intersecting arcs and straight paths that represented the path to life. These charts were the only solid thing the men owned. They were the proof that they still existed in a measurable world. The boring science of bathymetry also played a role in their cartography. To know where they were, they sometimes looked down instead of up. By using a sounding line long wire with a lead weight, they could measure the depth of the ocean. The topography of the ocean floor, with its deep trenches and shallow banks, acted as a hidden map. If the sounding line showed the water was getting shallower, it was a sign they were approaching the continental shelf of an island. The great white silence was a ceiling, but the depth was a clue. The crew would spend hours winching up miles of wire, their hands freezing, just to get a single number that might confirm their proximity to land. The quirky yet essential element of their mapping was the local naming etiquette. Because they were in uncharted territory, they had to name the features they encountered to make sense of their environment. They named ice floes the Rampart Berg or the Great Hummock. On Elephant Island, they named their tiny spit of land Point Wild. These names were more than labels. They were psychological landmarks. They turned the great white silence into a familiar neighborhood. By mapping their surroundings with names, they asserted a form of human ownership over a landscape that was trying to erase them. This was the cartography of the mind, a way to keep from getting lost in the infinite scale of the Antarctic. You find yourself looking over Worsley's shoulder as he hunches over a small, battered table in the snuggery. The light from the blubber lamp is dim, casting long, flickering shadows across the chart. You see the parallel rules move with a precise clack-clack sound, and the pencil leaves a thin, gray line across the white paper. Outside, the wind is a roar, but inside this small circle of light, the world is being organized. You realize that the great white silence is being tamed by geometry. You feel a sense of calm in the numbers and the lines. You are not just a man on an island. You are a coordinate on a map, and as long as Worsley keeps drawing, there is a way home. So, as we settle into the imaginary scratch of the dividers and the steady needle of the compass, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the measurement of the void. It was a place where a bubble was a level and a line on a chart was a prophecy. They proved that the human mind can find its way through the most featureless wildernesses as long as it has the tools to measure the stars and the discipline to believe in the mathematics of the path. In the great white silence, the most dangerous pressure was not exerted by the ice against the hull, but by the isolation against the human mind. When a group of men is confined to a small, unchanging space for hundreds of days, with no external news and the constant threat of death, the psychological boring of the routine can lead to a specific type of mental erosion. Shackleton, though not a trained psychologist, was a master of human behavioral maintenance. He understood that to survive the Antarctic, one had to govern the internal landscape as strictly as the external one. This section examines the logistics of sanity. the specific mental disciplines and social engineering used to prevent the polar madness that had claimed the minds of so many previous explorers. The primary strategy was the regulation of structured boredom. Shackleton knew that an idle mind in the Antarctic would eventually turn toward despair or conflict. He instituted a rigid daily routine that applied to everyone, from the aristocrats to the sailors. Every day began at the same time with the same boring tasks: scrubbing the decks even when the ship was frozen, exercising the dogs, and cleaning the living quarters. This structure acted as a mechanical metronome for the men's lives. The Great White Silence was a chaotic, unpredictable force. The routine was a predictable, human counterforce. By focusing on the minute details of cleanliness and order, the men were able to maintain a sense of agency over their lives. One must consider the physics of flattened hierarchy. In most Edwardian expeditions, there was a sharp social divide between officers and crew. Shackleton intentionally collapsed this structure. He made the scientists perform the dirty jobs: shoveling snow, butchering seals, and cleaning the dogloos alongside the sailors. This was a psychological masterstroke. It prevented the resentment that typically breeds in isolation and created a unity of hardship. The Great White Silence treated everyone equally. Shackleton ensured the social structure did the same. This prevented the formation of cliques or factions that could lead to a mutiny. In the snuggery on Elephant Island, there were no masters and servants, only 28 survivors sharing a single smoky room. The most vital mental tool was the social evening protocol. Every night after the evening meal, Shackleton encouraged and sometimes mandated entertainment. This included sing-alongs accompanied by Leonard Hussey's banjo, debates on absurd topics, and the reading of the few books they possessed. The Great White Silence was a visual and auditory vacuum. The music and the laughter were sensory fillers that kept the men connected to their humanity. Hussey's banjo, in particular, was treated as a vital piece of medical equipment. Shackleton insisted it be saved from the sinking ship, calling it mental tonic for the men. The sound of the banjo strings was a high-frequency defiance of the low-frequency groaning of the ice. A critical and boring psychological necessity was the management of information. Shackleton was the only one who carried the full weight of their predicament. He was careful to share only enough information to keep the men focused while shielding them from his deepest anxieties. He practiced what is now called optimistic realism. He never lied about the danger, but he always focused on the next mechanical step toward rescue. This prevented decision fatigue among the crew. While Shackleton and Worsley calculated the life-or-death navigation of the James Caird, the men on Elephant Island were encouraged to focus on small victories, finding a new penguin colony or repairing a torn boot. The Great White Silence was a macro problem. Shackleton broke it down into micro tasks. The boring but essential science of conflict escalation was another of Shackleton's skills. In the cramped quarters of the snuggery, a small disagreement over a piece of meat or a misplaced sock could explode into violence. Shackleton monitored the men's moods with the precision of a barometer. If he noticed two men were becoming irritable with each other, he would subtly change the watch schedule to separate them or assign them a difficult physical task to burn off their nervous energy. He used humor as a weapon, often making himself the butt of a joke to diffuse tension. The Great White Silence was a pressure cooker. Shackleton was the safety valve, constantly bleeding off the psychological steam before it could rupture the group. The quirky, yet effective, mental anchor was the imaginary feast. To cope with the monotony of their diet and the constant hunger, the men developed a culture of gastronomic dreaming. They would sit for hours, describing in detail the meals they would eat upon their return to London. They discussed the texture of the bread, the scent of the roasting beef, and the specific vintage of the wine. This was a form of cognitive distraction. By engaging the sensory imagination, they were able to momentarily override the physical signals of hunger and cold. The great white silence was a void, but their minds were filled with the sights and smells of a world they refused to let go of. You find yourself sitting in the shadows of the snuggery, listening to the plink-plink of the banjo. Around you, men with soot-stained faces are singing a popular London music hall song. Outside, a hurricane is trying to tear the boats from their stone foundations. But inside, the atmosphere is one of bizarre, defiant cheer. You look at Shackleton, who is watching the men with a quiet, analytical gaze. You realize that he isn't just listening to the music. He is measuring the vibration of the group. You feel a strange sense of safety, not because the island is safe, but because the social machine is still running smoothly. You realize that as long as the songs continue and the routine holds, the great white silence cannot get inside your head. So, as we settle into the imaginary strum of the banjo and the murmur of the imaginary feast, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the fortification of the mind. It was a place where a joke was a lifeline and a routine was a shield. They proved that the human spirit can remain sane even in the most absolute isolation, as long as it has a leader to provide the structure and a crew to share the burden of the boring daily survival. For over a century, the final chapter of the Endurance was written in the great white silence of the seabed. After the ship was crushed and swallowed by the ice on November 21, 1915, it descended nearly 10,000 feet into the dark, frigid depths of the Weddell Sea, while Shackleton and his men returned to the world. The ship became a ghost, a legendary relic resting in a place so remote and inhospitable that many believed it would never be seen again. However, in March 2022, a modern expedition using state-of-the-art subsea technology managed to locate the wreck. This final section examines the physics of the deep-sea discovery, the preservation of the ship in the abyssal silence, and how the legacy of the Endurance continues to define our understanding of human and mechanical resilience. The primary factor in the ship's survival was the biochemistry of the deep cold. One must consider the logistics of the search grid. Finding a 144-foot wooden ship in the vastness of the Weddell Sea is a mathematical nightmare. The search team, led by Dr. John Shears and Menson Bound, utilized the original 1915 navigation logs of Frank Worsley. Despite the boring and difficult conditions of the original drift, Worsley's solar and chronometer readings were so accurate that the modern team found the wreck within 4 miles of his last recorded position. This is a testament to the mechanical precision of the 19th century surviving into the 21st. The Great White Silence had hidden the ship, but Worsley's numbers provided the digital key to its location. The technology used for the discovery was the Sabertooth Hybrid Underwater Vehicle, AUV. These are sophisticated robotic platforms capable of operating autonomously at depths of 3,000 meters. Unlike tethered ROVs, the Sabertooth could swim miles away from the research ship Agulhas to paint the seabed, and high-definition cameras to capture images. The great white silence of the water was penetrated by pulses of acoustic energy and beams of LED light. The vehicle had to navigate through the same shifting pack ice that had trapped Shackleton, requiring the mother ship to maintain a constant ice-breaking routine to keep the launch and recovery area clear. It was a mechanical struggle across two different eras. The state of the wreck revealed the physics of the ice crush. The footage showed the ship's hull had been buckled and torn open in the midsection, the exact area where the ice had exerted the most pressure in 1915. However, the bow and stern remained remarkably intact. The great white silence of the sinking process was actually quite violent. As the ship filled with water and descended, the internal air pockets likely imploded and the heavy masts snapped and fell across the deck. Yet, the ship settled on the silt in an upright position, as if it were still waiting for its crew. The preservation of the wheelhouse and the rigging provides a mechanical blueprint for maritime historians to study the construction of early 20th century polar vessels. A critical part of the modern legacy is the sanctuary status of the site. Under the Antarctic Treaty, the wreck of the Endurance is designated as a protected historic site and monument. No part of the ship can be touched, recovered, or disturbed. It remains a living tomb of the heroic age of exploration. This ensures that the great white silence of the wreck remains absolute. For modern researchers, the ship is a benchmark for baseline environment studies. By studying how the wood and metal have interacted with the deep-sea chemistry over 107 years, scientists can better understand the long-term effects of climate change and ocean acidification on Antarctic heritage. The quirky, yet profound conclusion to the story is the legacy of the unlost. Shackleton's primary claim to fame was that he lost his ship but saved his men. The discovery of the Endurance in such perfect condition brings a sense of closure to the mechanical part of the narrative. It proves that while the ice can destroy the function of a machine, it cannot erase its history. The great white silence is no longer a place of mystery, but a place of memory. The ship serves as a reminder that the human spirit and the tools it creates are part of a continuous cycle of discovery, failure, and eventual rediscovery. You find yourself standing on the bridge of a modern research vessel, watching the live feed from the underwater robot. The screen is a deep, velvety black, until suddenly a beam of light hits a wooden rail. You see the grain of the oak and the glint of a brass fitting. Then the camera pans to the stern, and you see it, Endurance. A chill runs down your spine that has nothing to do with the Antarctic air. You realize that you are looking at the very thing that Shackleton looked at as he gave the order to abandon ship. The great white silence has finally given up its ghost, and in that moment, the century between you and the crew disappears. You are part of the story now, a witness to the endurance of both wood and will. So, as we conclude this journey through the flicker and frost of the Endurance, remember that the story of Shackleton is a study in the persistence of the path. It was a place where a successful failure became a foundational myth of leadership and resilience. They proved that even when the ship sinks and the ice closes in, the name and the spirit it represents can survive the longest of silences.